So, with all these practical things, welcome once again. And now I will say welcome to Mark Hertsgaard.
As a journalist who has spent much of my life living and working abroad, I am always very grateful to interpreters. They are the unsung heroes of a lot of the reporting that you read in the papers and see on television. And as a communicator myself, I very much value the work that they do and am jealous of it, I must say, as someone who loves a bunch of different languages. So thank you very much for that. And thank you, Lisa, for having invited me here. This is a really great pleasure to be with you all. And of course, you're always supposed to say that when you start a speech, but in this case, it really is true for me, because I come to you as not just a journalist who has written about climate change for many years, but also as a father of a delightful 8-year-old girl who is, I guess in some ways, I don't know if she's the star of my book, Hot, but she certainly thinks she's the star of that book. And she was a lot of the reason for writing that book. And therefore, when I have a chance to speak to a room full of people like yourselves as a father, I'm very grateful for the opportunity, because we need as many people as possible to be as involved as possible in the fight against climate change, or my daughter and your daughter and the other boys and girls around the world are going to have a very tough time with it. So, Lisa, thank you again for bringing me here. And I'm just going to start with a little story that happened to me the other day in San Francisco, and when it happened, I immediately thought of you all here and the kind of work that you do. I was on my way home on my bicycle through the streets of San Francisco, and my eye was caught by a passing bus. And it wasn't really the bus itself, it was an ad on the side of the bus. It said, "Become wildly successful." I thought, that's always a good idea, wildly successful. But before I could read the rest of it, the bus pulled away. So I pedaled after it, and I caught up to it at the next stop sign, sort of. I had to pull around to the side, and there I saw, "Become wildly successful without becoming," and then he pulled away again. So I sped after him one more time, and this time he got stopped at a red light. So I was able to pull up right next to him, and I could read the whole thing. "Become wildly successful without becoming a jerk nobody likes." And it turned out it was an advertisement for the University of San Francisco, urging students to come to USF to become wildly successful without becoming a jerk that nobody likes. Which in San Francisco, we're now, and have been for many years, sort of the hotbed of IT and Silicon Valley, and a lot of get-rich-quick ideas. And of course, that famous slogan of Google, "Don't be evil," that the USF ad was kind of capturing there. And I thought it was a very effective ad because it goes after that irony of trying to be, can you be wildly successful without becoming a jerk? And we certainly know that there are plenty of examples out in the world where the opposite is common enough. And I think that's what makes the ad effective, is that it captures our attention. I can think of a bunch of different companies right off the top of my head. And unfortunately, the clothing business itself has most recently furnished an appalling example of how you can be wildly successful while being not just a jerk, but murderous. And of course, I'm referring to the factory collapse in Dhaka in Bangladesh. I read in the news this morning that the death toll there is now over 1,000 people, 1,000 workers, hundreds more injured. And this collapse, this catastrophe happened despite abundant warnings that the building was unsafe, abundant complaints from the workers themselves. And meanwhile, the owner of that factory was a billionaire, or pretty close to it, had plenty of money, wildly successful, you might say. A jerk, at the very least. And when I saw those stories, I thought back to when I was in Bangladesh reporting hot, and I remember meeting a mother and a daughter on a ferry boat when I was on my way down to the south of Bangladesh, and I was on my way back to the capital at that point. And there was a little girl, she was probably about 6 years old, who I saw on the edge of this group of people who were having a conversation, and I was one of them. I was the only white person in the boat, so I was obviously an object of some interest. And I was with a colleague who was kindly translating for me, and this little girl, you could just see the light of intelligence in her eyes. She could not take her eyes or her ears off of what we were talking about. And the man I was with was a teacher. He had children of his own, and we began to engage this little girl in conversation. And she talked about how much she would love to be able to study. That was her dream. And then after a few minutes, her mother appeared, and we were able to speak with her a little bit. Her mother worked in a garment factory in Dhaka. She didn't tell me which one, but in recent days I've been wondering, was she in that fire? Was she one of the 1,000 people who lost their lives because of the cruelty and the greed and the corruption of people who should have known better? And if she was, what's happened to that little girl? I did something that day that I almost never do as a reporter, but I couldn't help myself. As I gave that little girl, not her mother, but I gave that little girl about what would have amounted to about $20 US. And I said, this is for your schooling. And she looked at it, and when she saw it, her eyes exploded in her head almost, because to her that was an enormous amount of money. As I think back on it, it's probably as much as her mother earned in a week's worth of work, if not more. And so when we think about what we're doing, especially the work that all of you are doing, I want you to try to think about that mother and that little girl. Those are the people that you are working for. Those are the people who will benefit from the kind of work that you're doing. And those are also the people who need our help in dealing with climate change, which, as Lisa mentions, is now finally recognized as the biggest challenge facing civilization today, because it cuts across all of the different issues that we care about: poverty and health and security and prosperity. In Bangladesh, when I was in the south of Bangladesh, that is ground zero for climate change. That's why I went there. And you can already see in the south of Bangladesh the effects of climate change. Of course, the south of Bangladesh is one big delta. It's about as flat as a pancake, because it's where most of the rivers that flow off of the Himalayas empty into the sea. And because it is so flat down there, even though there's only been 6 inches of sea level rise in the last century, you can go down there and you interview farmers, and their land is already salty. The land is salty because the water is pushing up from the sea. And you can still grow rice there, but you can't grow very much of it because the saltier it gets, the lower the productivity goes. And this is just one example of many. I describe many more in Hot about how climate change is already changing the daily realities of people around the world. And so I'm here today to try to talk to you about that problem, but I want to just touch one more time on that slogan. How to be wildly successful without being a jerk that nobody likes. That's really what we need to do, because we know it does not have to be this way. We know that we can provide clothing and shelter and food in ways that do not kill thousands of people. And we know that because there's plenty of people and businesses who are doing it already. And in fact, I have a feeling that the room is full with them this morning, that a lot of you are exactly those kinds of people. And because we know that it can be done, I submit to you that really it is a choice. It is a choice whether you are going to be a wildly successful jerk or a wildly successful, decent person. You can do either. And this is a choice about how you define what does it mean to be wildly successful. Is it about maximizing your profit no matter what? Or is it about, as the end of that bus advertisement says, is it about changing the world? University of San Francisco says, come change the world from here. Become wildly successful without being a jerk, and come change the world from here. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, is how we do that. And I just want to make it clear that I salute each and every one of you who is making that choice already, because it is not an easy choice to make with one's life. I think it takes not just a moral compass, but it also takes guts. It takes mental toughness to believe that it matters to do the right thing, to believe that it can make a difference to do the right thing. Because Lord knows there's lots of reasons to doubt that taking the high road actually makes much of a difference. And yet, one sticks with it, and I suspect this is true for many people in this room, because you can't imagine doing otherwise. You can't live with yourself if you wouldn't do otherwise. And I think that is the spirit that we need, this determination to take that higher road, to eschew the easy path, and do what is necessary to make this world a better place. That's the spirit we need in the fight against poverty. It's the spirit we need in the fight against climate change. And I'm reminded here of a quote from the former governor of the state of Vermont here in the United States, Maxine Kumin, who, after she retired from office, she was giving a speech one day, and she had gone through and listed the many difficulties confronting her state in the face of climate change. And she said that, my long years in politics and public life have convinced me that the pessimists are right. The pessimists are right. But it is the optimists who change the world. The pessimists are right about how hard and difficult and hopeless it all is, but it is the optimists who change the world. And that is what I'm, again, as a father, hoping that we will be able to do on climate change. And I'm going to talk about climate change now and how we can fight it. And the main message I want to bring to you this morning is that we can fight it, and that we are fighting it, and that there are people and institutions right now who are not just fighting this fight, but they are winning this fight. And they are winning it against very large interests, powerful corporations, and politicians in Washington who are completely prepared to be jerks. People and institutions like ExxonMobil, which for 15 years, 20 years now I should say, has been spending millions of dollars to deny the science of climate change, even as their own scientists privately are telling them that it's true. I doubt that there's too many people in this room who are still climate deniers or climate skeptics, but just in the case there are, I'll just mention quickly that if you go back to 1995, right? That's 18 years ago. We now know, because of papers that have been divulged during court proceedings, that the scientists who were reporting to the fossil fuel companies, to a group called the Global Climate Coalition, which was the oil and the coal and the auto companies and the electric utilities who had formed in the early 90s to try and deny climate change, their own scientists privately were telling them that the science behind climate change is solid, well-established, and cannot be refuted, were the exact words. This created a problem, of course, for the Global Climate Coalition, which had been running full-page ads in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today and all the other papers, and trying to push against the journalists like myself to say that, oh, there's two sides to this and the science isn't settled and we mustn't be hasty and blah, blah, blah. Their own scientists were telling them this, that the science was, in fact, pretty clear. So they had a problem, and they solved this problem very simply. They just decided, the board of directors of the Global Climate Coalition decided to suppress that report. To suppress that report. So when you see these ads, or when you see a politician like Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, or Speaker Boehner, so representatives, when you see those people talking about how it's not so clear that climate change is real and that the scientists disagree, you can make your own moral judgments about them, about whether they are lying deliberately or they're just ignorant. But it's one or the other, because they were told 18 years ago privately that this is the case, and they are still prepared to lie about it. That should tell you everything you need to know about the other side, except, as I say, that they can be beaten. And I want to talk about 3 ways that the climate fight is being won, partly because I know from having written about this and from talking to so many people over the years, it's very easy. When the topic is climate change, it is very easy to get pretty dark and pretty glum and pretty despairing. You think it's such a big problem, the momentum is so great, what can we do about it? It's very easy for people to despair. And we must not succumb to despair. It is a great temptation that must be shunned. Not just because it paralyzes us. Despair is a dead end. I mean, I get it. I understand why one can be discouraged on this topic. But if you think that there's nothing to be done, you are guaranteeing that outcome. Because the one thing we cannot afford is paralysis and passivity. So that's one reason to avoid despair. But the other reason, speaking as a journalist, is that it is factually incorrect. There are a lot of examples of how we can win this fight, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them that I hope will suggest ways that you can be involved in this fight in your own work, through your own businesses, through your own professional and civic networks. So, as I say, there'll be 3. The first that I'm going to talk about is coal in the United States. The second is also here in the United States, and that's about how we prepare to live with the impacts of climate change. I'll be talking about Seattle and King County, Washington. And then the third is probably the most hopeful story that came out of HOT, and that's a story that comes from overseas, from Africa, and involves some of the poorest people on the planet who are living an example that all of us could do well to emulate. So first, coal. Coal, for those of you who don't know it, is by far the worst culprit in climate change. And I assume most of you already know the basics of climate science, that basically what happens with global warming is that when an excessive amount of carbon dioxide is released and other greenhouse gases, they get trapped by up in the atmosphere, and they in effect act like a greenhouse or a blanket around the Earth, and they make the temperatures on the Earth rise. This is now very well established science, and the single activity that has done the most over the last 250 years of industrialization to cause this problem is the burning of coal. Coal, compared to oil and natural gas, the other two main fossil fuels, coal is far more carbon intensive, far dirtier as well. And so when you burn coal, it creates an excessive amount of CO2. And so in light of this, a number of activists in the United States, led by the Sierra Club, but organizing across the country at the grassroots level, decided about 10 years ago that they had to do something to stop coal. Because these were groups, for example, a guy I'm thinking of in Minnesota, who ran a group called Fresh Energy. And they were working very hard to get solar and wind and alternative energy sources up and running. And they were celebrating, he says, you know, the penny dropped for him one day when they were celebrating the fact that they had finally got this 110 megawatt complex of wind turbines up and running. And then the next day they saw that there had just been approved 2 900 megawatt coal plants. And he said 100 megawatts of clean energy and 1,800 megawatts of filthy energy. What do you call that? He said, I call that losing. And he said, we decided we had to completely change our strategy, which is interesting from a business standpoint, right? It's very easy to stay incremental, and it's sometimes risky to take that big shift in a completely new direction. But that's what they did. They said we were going to stop focusing so much on clean energy and start focusing on where we can get more bang for the buck and shutting down these coal plants and above all, preventing the new ones from being built. And so that's what they did. If you want deep information on this, you can read the story. I did a story about this about a year ago in Mother Jones magazine, and it's also on my website, markhertsgaard.com. But in brief, what happened was that activists, grassroots activists, just like yourselves, working in the red states, the supposedly red states in the Midwest and in the South, in the space of about 8 years, blocked 174 new proposed coal-fired power plants. These were all plants that the Bush-Cheney administration had put on the boards, that the local utilities were pushing through, and these citizens got together, and by doing grassroots politics, they blocked 174 of them. And what was interesting about it was that it was not just the usual suspects. It was not just those greenies, those enviro clean energy types. They were a big part of it, but equally big part of it, and this is again another lesson for how progress is made, was that they built alliances. They worked in coalition with people that they hadn't worked with before, including farmers, including nurses, and doctors were some of the biggest voices on this. And the nurses and the doctors, sure, they cared about climate change, but more than that, they cared about what coal does to public health in the immediate realm. You know, we kill, by burning coal in the United States, we kill at least 13,000 people every year. That's an EPA figure, and it's a conservative one. We also, at the same time, cause literally tens of thousands of heart attacks, hundreds of thousands of cases of asthma, especially among little children. We know this is happening, and yet we continue burning the coal. So that the the nurses and the doctors were very involved. And another interesting part of this coalition were local public officials, including the mayor of Dallas, Texas. Now, that is not generally a place you think of as being somebody who's going to take a stand against coal. Why did she do that? And it was a she. She did that because she wants businesses to continue to want to locate in Dallas. And she calculated that if we have this terrible pollution, they were about to build the largest complex of coal-fired power plants in the United States in history, about 9 of them outside of Dallas, Fort Worth. And she said, you know, we're not going to get the quality companies, because the quality companies cannot get the quality executives and staff to come to a place where their kids are going to be suffering from this kind of air pollution, which parenthetically is also a problem that the leadership in China is now confronting. If you noticed in January, they had some of the worst pollution in history. I speak as someone who went to China in 1996. I was I think the first Western reporter to go there and report on the Chinese environmental crisis. And you could see this coming then. And now they're living it. And how many Western companies are going to want to send their people there because of this? So this kind of a coalition of people working, again, at the grassroots level, doing the very basic and admittedly sometimes tedious work of retail politics, of going to those town planning meetings, going to the regulatory board, reading those eye-glazingly boring technical reports and knowing what they mean and knowing how to intervene in the regulatory process, and writing letters to the editor, and going to lobby your state legislature, not the Washington, D.C., lobbying your state legislature and your regulators. And yes, occasionally having marches and demonstrations and going to the governor's office, as they did in Iowa, and working with enlightened financiers as well to make the argument that this is a bad deal. And in state after state after state, they beat these coal-fired power plants. And we're talking about states like Kentucky, the heart of coal country. And these activists working at the local level beat it. And you didn't hear about this, did you? How many people in this room knew about this story before this morning? Raise your hand. There might be one or two. 1, 2. Don't be shy. You don't have to be shy about it. Be glad that you knew this. Why don't you know this? You don't know this because my business, the news media, did not tell you this. It wasn't like it was secret. It wasn't like it was hidden. But they didn't tell you this for various reasons, one of the most important being that it wasn't happening in Washington, D.C. In fact, while all this was happening, in Washington, D.C., there was a very different kind of battle going on over climate change. And it was a battle being fought over the cap-and-trade legislation. Do you all remember that on Capitol Hill in 2009 after Obama came in 2010? And that was the narrative that the media watched. And surprise, surprise, that climate initiative went down in flames. Why was that? Well, that's a whole other discussion, but one clear reason to me is that when you are in Washington, D.C., if you're fighting for progress on climate change, you are fighting on the terrain that is controlled by the enemy. Big coal, big oil, they don't get everything they want in Washington, but they can stop anything they want. They have that much power at least. And so the narrative that comes out of the media that fills the public's heads is that, oh, America's not ready for climate legislation. Well, that's because Exxon and Peabody Coal and everybody else basically has half the Congress on their direct role and the other half is frightened to oppose them. So sure, they get their way. But does that mean that the country is not ready for climate legislation or for climate action? Clearly not, because meanwhile, out in the red states of the Midwest and the South, people working at the local level of democracy, where democracy still does have a chance to function, were beating coal. And by beating coal, which remember is the dirtiest carbon fuel, by beating coal, they achieved as much as that law that failed in Washington would have achieved had it passed. So one lesson from this is be very careful about the kinds of lessons that you draw from the media. from what the media is telling you. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm not saying that they're out to make you stupid, but they certainly don't tell you the full story. Try to reach out and read in alternative publications like Mother Jones, like The Nation magazine, where I also write. I write now for the Daily Beast as well. In the past, I've occasionally written for places like Vanity Fair and the Atlantic magazine, but I've never stayed working very long for any of the mainstream news organizations because they're really not interested in doing stories like this. They're much more interested in doing the stories that you read about all the time, about whatever the latest entertainment figure is, or superficialities, and then the horse race of politics. So you need to reach out a little bit more to get alternative information. And when you do, it tells you that this is a fight that we can win. And by the way, these activists were not just stopping coal. At the same time, they were also building up green energy and working with the local labor unions to say, look, we want to add jobs. We don't want to kill jobs. And so when we oppose this coal plant, we want to take that money and instead put it into energy efficiency and solar and wind and refurbishing places so that we can use less energy, and that creates far more jobs, by the way, than going with coal or nuclear or any of the other examples.